Hey, I'm Joel Wanasek. I'm a pro mixer and the co-founder of NailTheMix.com, the coolest place to learn how to mix music on the internet. And today we're going to break down one of the sickest metal mixes of all time, which is Clouds Over California by Devil Driver, mixed by the legendary Andy Sneap. We're going to deconstruct this mix, break it down, and talk about it. Let's have a go. All right, so like right out of the gate, that may be the best guitar tone ever in heavy metal. Just listen to how sick that is. I mean, that's just the bar in guitar tone for heavy guitars. I mean, Andy Sneap is probably the best in the world at guitars. I mean, maybe even undisputably the best in the world. And I feel like this is just peak Andy Sneap. This tone is so freaking ridiculous. Let's pay attention to the EQ of the guitar curve. So listen to the low end. So there's a lot of bloom to that chug, meaning it's not highly compressed. I know obviously Andy's very famous for his little C4 low end taming trick from back in the day. There's actually quite a bit of cab chug and swing in that tone. Bottom end is very tight, but very thick and very fat. Listen to how much resonance those chugs. There's a lot of low end in those guitars. I mean, a ton of it. I would say down maybe as low as 80 hertz. I'd have to open up an EQ to start messing around, but it sounds like after that, it's a sharp filter. So it's a very tight, very fat bottom. Now, the other thing to pay attention to on the top of these guitars is listen to the clarity of the notes, right? And like how smooth the top is, right? It's got that upper bite to it, but there's not a lot of fizz or like hiss or like, you know, super high top end. Now, the only way to get guitars that sound like this is through an insanely sick picking hand on the guitar player. So when this kicks in, listen to how articulate these chugs are. I mean, you can hear how hard that guitar player picks. I mean, he's just destroying the strings. It sounds insane. There's so much articulation and punch. So the guitar tone immediately just, it's mind-blowing how good it is. It's so freaking good. Like I said, when I'm sitting there like dialing in guitars, this is like one of the things I open up and I'm like, okay, this is the bar. Like, how do I get something kind of even in the realm of this good? You know what I mean? It's just that insane. Okay, so now when you have really fat guitars, and you can see Andy prioritizes that a lot in his mixes, you have to make certain decisions on your drums and your bass to kind of fit around that. So pay attention to how the thickness of the guitars interacts with the rest of the mix. Particularly pay attention to the drum tone. Okay, so what do we notice about Andy's drums here? Okay, first off, Andy uses really aggressive, snappy, attacky drums with a lot of transient on them. They're very dry and direct sounding, if that makes sense. There's not like a lot of snare room sample, but there's a lot of snare reverb. So he's got a very clicky, snappy, aggressively compressed kind of drum sound. I always felt like when I listened to these old mixes, by Andy, like the snare drum always felt like I was getting slapped in the face, and the kick drum always felt like I was just getting kicked in the chest. You know what I mean? Like it just rips your face off. So if he had really fat drums, like for example, a kick drum with a ton of like 50 hertz in it, what would happen is it would stomp all over the guitars in the low end of the mix. And because this is a faster tempo song, you wouldn't be able to get away with it. So instead, he goes for a very tight bottom and a very thick guitar to kind of fill in that lower mid range and that, you know, upper bass frequency, and the drums kind of just, you know, focus more on the attack side. Okay, so you see how much bottom end is not in like the kick drum or the snare. You know, there's not a big 200 bomb in the snare. You know, the kick drum doesn't have a big 50 hertz in it. It's very smacky, very transient, very aggressive, very mid forward, and I just love that. It sounds amazing. And like I said, the reason is that you want it to work with the big guitars. So balance-wise, let's pay attention to the guitars and the kick and the snare. First off, the kick and the snare are extremely loud. The kick is driving a lot of energy. I would say the kick and the snare are slightly above the guitars in terms of balance. So pay attention to that. Pay attention to how loud the snare is. I think the snare is actually just a slightly bit louder than the kick. It really rips your face off. It's so sick. This mix is just, it's incredible. It's totally incredible. A couple other things here to note on the drums. So one thing when I listen to this snare drum, it's very direct. It doesn't sound like he uses much room sample, if any at all. But what I do hear is the sound of the snare drum being smashed into a really long, like all room kind of reverb. So you can really hear it on the fills earlier in the song. Pay attention to the tail of the snare. Can really hear that room. It's very bright. So what he uses is like a really nice long tail reverb to kind of extend the snare and use it as the glue in the ambience, but it doesn't sound like a big cannon shot. Like for example, like a lot of modern metal mixes, you hear people cranking so much 200 hertz in their snare where it just sounds absolutely absurd. And then on top of that, you're using these big room samples, so everything sounds like it's in a massive room. Here it sounds very dry, very direct, but it's got that, that nice long tail reverb in there. So what it does is it makes the snare sound really aggressive, but it still gives the snare that glue and ambience where it kind of pulls it together. Okay, so pay attention to the cymbal balance here. Okay, so EQ-wise, the cymbals are filtered pretty high up. Like I don't hear like a lot of body in the cymbals. And I think, again, the reason is we have these really fat guitars. There's just like such a large amount of bottom end in those guitars. And if the guitars were thinner, you would be able to use more like the body and the overheads, but you kind of got to get that stuff out of there. I think what he's chosen to do here is to kind of prioritize the cymbals a little bit up in the frequency spectrum. Now the cymbals are very smooth on top. There's not like a lot of like, high-end hype or anything like that, or like extended air frequencies. They're mixed loud, but they're kind of out of the way of the massive wall of the guitars. I mean, obviously, like when you listen to this, you can hear, Andy really prioritizes his guitars, which I think are his biggest strength as a mixer. I mean, he's incredible at everything, but his guitar tone is just like, the best in the world. So when you're that good at guitar, you might as well feature the guitars as a very, very driving part of your mixes. And kind of, I feel like all of the mix decisions are made around having this massively crushing guitar sound and making sure that everything works synergistically with that and kind of gets out of the way. So, you can really, really, really just feel the just dominating presence of that tone. Okay, so listen to the cymbal volume. So the overheads are mixed pretty loud. Okay, vocally. Dude, you're gonna skip bass? No, we'll get to bass in a bit. Vocals to me are mixed at about snare level. They're very mid-rangey. A lot of like 2K, 3K, somewhere in there. I don't hear a ton of bottom end in the vocals. Like it's not like a super bass. Again, there's no room for it in the low mids because the guitars are just crushing and they're so fat. You gotta move everything out of the frequencies. The vocals got some subtle doubling on them that kind of sounds really brutal and sick. They sound very dry, but there's definitely some like verb and delay, but it's tucked subtly. It's hard to kind of break it out, at least in this section, because this tempo is so fast. Okay, pay attention to the bass guitar. Vocally, like I said, there's a couple layers. It's screaming, it's straightforward. It's like a pop song, where there's like all these different layers to break down and harmonies and all this stuff. This is metal, you know what I mean? It's just pissed off aggression. Okay, so pay attention to the bass guitar sounds. Let me roll back here to the intro. If you really listen, you can hear how the bass is kind of tucked in. There's a bit of a distortion on the top of the bass. It's very mid-rangey. The bass has a high pass on it where there's not a ton of sub, in terms of like 50. Well, I'm going to define sub as like, below 50 hertz. You know what I mean? There's not like a big 30 hertz in this. Again, you can't with the tempo this fast. It's impossible. So right here, you can hear, if you listen carefully, the bass has a very commanding presence in the middle, but the top end of the bass is not carved in a way where it sounds super loud and it kind of gets in the way of the guitar. It kind of just fills in that mid range. It sounds like he's got that high pass that maybe, I want to say like 60 to 70 hertz, if that makes sense. So the bottom end is very tight. It's very fat, but the bass is kind of living down in that like 60 to 100 range. And that may sound like obvious, but there's a lot of mixes, for example, I could point to like Andy Wallace, for example, or like Nickelback mixes have a ton of sub low and stuff like that in the kick and things like that. So, coming back to this, because this is metal, it's tight, the bass is very, very, very like, we'll call it like upper bass range. And by upper, I mean 80 hertz, whereas like, lower to me is like 30 to 40 hertz. You can hear that slight clank on the bass. We'll call it like somewhere between 1 to 2K that kind of plays in with the guitar top. One thing that's really amazing in this mix, we've heard how thick the bottom end of the guitars is. Listen to how the bottom end of the guitars, because they were solo in the earlier part of the song, but the bottom end of the guitar seamlessly melds into the bass and just forms one massive wall of a low end. And you know, this is a thick mix, even though it's thinner, if that makes sense. It's not like this super blown out bottom end. It sounds super thick and very compact and very tight. And it really, really sounds great. Yeah, it's absolutely killer. Let me fast forward here, see if I can find some leads. That's a pretty cool guitar tone. You know, there's some like doubler effect on it or something like that. And maybe like a short delay. Yeah, I mean, this mix is awesome. Like I said, I think this is probably the best metal guitar tone of all time. I feel like now in music, so many people are just kind of grabbing presets and stuff like that because it's so hard to be this good at guitar. You know what I mean? Like, this is like unicorn status. So, you know, maybe we've just all given up, but I really wish people push themselves now to kind of get guitar tones that, you know, like you go back a decade ago, guitar was a competition. Now I feel like people are kind of just phoning tones in. We got all these nice digital tools and it's great. You know, we can get good sounds out of them. But like when you listen to something like this, you just realize how high the bar is set and just how much better it is, you know, the A+ level versus everything else. So it's kind of like, I wish people strived more to push the envelope to get sounds like this. Maybe we're just getting lazy in modern music, but man, back in the day, like you'd listen to a record and like the guitar tones would come in and you would just be like, oh my God, how did they get that sound? I hope we all try to up the bar and try to get, you know, our tones to this level again here in music production, because I mean, obviously, you know, Andy is just on his own level of talent, but we can all strive and hope so in heavy music. It's incredible. And I think it's definitely one of the best metal mixes of all time. So let me know what you think of this mix in the comments below. And if you enjoy this type of content, please click like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Of course, I'm doing tons of mixing content and stuff like that on my TikTok and my Instagram. That is at Joel Wanasek. And of course, nailthemix.com if you want to learn how to mix heavy music. Thank you so much for watching. And of course, if you got any bands you want me to break down or react to, just drop them in the comments below and I will do my best to get to them. Thank you.